Welcome to the third season of That's So Second Millennium, the Catholic Science podcast where we explore the fascinating borderlands between science and theology through realms of philosophy, human experience, and more.
Welcome back to episode 124 of That's So Second Millennium. So Bill and I have already been talking a lot this morning. We'd like to bring you just a short podcast today, really kind of building off of our previous episode where we talked to Dr. Jean-Pierre Isbouts about the history of Jesus, the political and to some degree the economic, and therefore the geomorphology, that comes into the economy, because after all that governs agriculture. Where's the land? How much does it rain? Little details like that. It makes a difference. So at some point, the preparation for that, I asked him whether he would want to talk about the geology per se, and he sort of, he probably very correctly demurred and said, "No, that's. I mean, he's already got a lot of specialties, doesn't he, Bill?"
That's right. He brings together an awful lot of disciplines already.
Yeah. It was perhaps a little too much to ask to add one more into the pile there. But just as someone who does have a degree or two in geology and just an interest in the subject matter, I thought it would be great to take an episode to talk just a little bit about the contacts between geology and the Old Testament. As we were discussing earlier, I don't know if this book exists or if this book needs to exist. But I think there's a real need for a book that really takes the best textual scholarship of Genesis in particular, other books, Exodus, and there's some other like the Book of Joshua and places scattered here and there, where geologic happenings occur at significant points in the history of of salvation history. There we go. There's a term I'm groping for, and to really bring people who are really knowledgeable about. Have a very good grasp on the geology of the Holy Land, as well as the texts, and and other stories in the ancient Near East that we have in written form of one kind or another, and to be able to really sort of bring those together and say what's the greatest concord that we can bring between these, because of course both of those records are inherently they're not complete. Scripture is not trying to give any kind of complete rundown of all the geologic happenings in Palestine and Mesopotamia and Egypt during the times that it narrates, nor is the geologic record ever perfect. It's not like, the sand, silt, and clay of, the basin that the Dead Sea is in aren't motivated to give us a complete record of everything that happened there. So
that is beautiful that the Bible, while clearly focused on being a book of faith and not of science, as Dr. Isbouts said last week, he realizes that, and you're stating now, that the Bible is so amazingly broad and full of connections to everything else that I think it would be a great way of reaching out to today's very science-minded population to say, well, what book you should look at more and learn a lot about, but also apply your own scientific knowledge to? The Bible. Yeah, I think it would attract scientists as well as people with theological frame of mind. And it's a great way for some people to get to know the story of Jesus, the story of creation, and everything in between a little better, according to their own kind of inclinations and interests.
Yeah, I thought that was he made the point, pretty emphatically in his book, and I'm pretty sure his other books, but, certainly the book In the Footsteps of Jesus that we were discussing last week, he makes the point very emphatically that, putting Jesus in his historical context is really important for understanding just the real import of what he was saying, as opposed to letting him sort of float in an idealized, environment like we can do so easily when we try to read the Bible by itself without its context. And likewise, looking at the context of the geology of the Holy Land is, I think, valuable. Even at the level of knowledge that I have, as I was telling Bill, I pulled about 5 papers. I think I read into the fourth one over the course of this week, about different aspects of the geology of the Holy Land. I didn't find the sort of big review paper that I was really kind of hoping for about the tectonics of it. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, if we look at it from the perspective of the Christian faith, all right, God has chosen to enact a central drama of, the human race in this particular part of the world. There's this planet, it behaves in this way. I mean, the context of, when you have a scientific perspective on just how big and how old the universe is, it gives us more of a sense of just how. I think it all comes back to that. St. Paul's extremely potent words. That I guess it's commonly understood to be a song or a chant or something that Paul reproduces in Philippians. Maybe he wrote it. He'd certainly be one of the likely candidates to write such a thing. But that God, the Son emptied himself in the incarnation, and to recognize the size of creation itself and the incredibly localized in time and space, environment of Palestine at what we now call the first century for just this very reason. That this is where, God took his, the transcendent, limitless, eternal God took a tiny, tiny spot in creation in this exact context. But anyway, and the geological aspect of that context is that it is at a very active plate boundary, and that it's a place where dramatic things have happened in the last, several tens of thousands of years, which is, an eye blink in geology. The entirety of human civilization is really quite short in the perspective of just this planet. So, so that, and there's so many, and there are dramatic, obviously, things that happen in the Bible. And it's easy to, we've drifted into the sense, and this was going on in the ancient world, actually. I'm listening to a different book, an audiobook about the fact that ancient people discovered fossils, and we really don't let ourselves think about that so much. The people in particular, the Mediterranean, did actually a lot of fossil collecting. There was a certain era in the first millennium BC, like the entirety of the first millennium BC, where Greeks in particular, because of course, there's more people who read Greek than anything else, any of the other languages that were circulating back in that era. So we know about those, and those texts have been preserved in greater numbers. We're more at sea and to know what, say Persians or people did with them, ancient bones. But there's a lot actually of mammoth and mastodon and ancient rhinoceros, and they actually milled around a lot of the Mediterranean, in the last 10 million years, let's say. It goes all, she's talking about stuff that goes all the way back to what's called the Miocene epoch, which is, gosh, if memory serves, at least 10 million years ago. And, really dramatic things have happened. The Mediterranean Sea has dried up completely, more than once in that time span. So it's been a salt flat that these animals could cross if they could find a little water here and there. Maybe they didn't cross it. Maybe they tried. Maybe they tried and died of thirst. That's a good way to become a fossil. Not necessarily an easy to find fossil if they're now at the bottom of the Mediterranean, but yeah. So of course, landscapes have been changing. There have been landslides, which are great things to capture large animal bones in. But the Greeks, for example, and other peoples as well, but the Greeks would find these massive bones, and they've turned to stone. They've been lithified, and so what did they make of them? In a lot of cases, so they're mammal bones. They don't look like anything too obvious, in terms of like matching known creatures. And the Greeks didn't know anything about elephants until late in the first millennium. So the logical thing to do if you found, mammoth bones in 800 BC was to say, well, maybe these are some giant hero. And at some point, the idea came about that humans and other creatures were all larger in the past. So we have, we're the lesser descendants of the great ancients. that belief goes a long way back. It's kind of an interesting perspective, and even the medievals still had that perspective in some ways, that the civilizations before them were greater than they were. In certain senses, certainly they could look back at the Roman Empire, but the Roman Empire itself looked back at earlier, maybe in some cases imaginary situations where there were people 15 feet tall. The heroes of great myths were these giants, and they fought giants, and they killed giants, and buried giants all over the Mediterranean. And so places, these bones would be found. So it's a dramatic landscape from that perspective. And then the Holy Land itself, Palestine, Israel, is itself. So it's the Dead Sea is there, and so what's famous about the Dead Sea? This is a question for Bill. Bill is taking the place of the rest of the audience here. He speaks on your behalf. This is my attempt to sort of gauge what knowledge is out there among educated people in the public.
I'll take geography for 400, Alex.
That's right.
Yeah, I think the Dead Sea is below sea level, right?
It is very far below sea level, yeah. As a matter of fact, it's the spot on the Earth's surface that's not covered with ocean that is the furthest below sea level. There are a few other places that are below sea level. There's a special tectonic feature going on. The Salton, there's Death Valley in California. I'm sure if the Salton Sea is actually below sea level or not, which is in Southern California. But I think the Salton Sea, so if you imagine a plate boundary with a transform fault, so two plates are sliding next to each other, one sliding past the other. That's a transform boundary. So the Dead Sea is along such a boundary. So there's the African plate, which includes a lot of the Mediterranean basin. And then there's the Arabian plate is actually separate from the Eurasian plate. And so that is, there's a slippage between them on a north to south plate boundary. And what happens is that plate boundary isn't straight. So if you're trying to have this curve, and then these two plate boundaries are trying to slide past each other, there's a spot where they're bunching up on one side, and then there's a spot where they're sort of pulling apart and leaving a hole on the other side. So that's sort of what is the, gosh, I'm groping for the exact term. I had it a few minutes ago, but it's a pull apart basin. I don't remember if that's the exact term or if it's just one of the legitimate terms. But that is one of the few ways that you can get land that's significantly below sea level. So there's this basin that's opened up along this transform fault. And then there's also structures that are called grabens, which are just sort of like troughs of the earth that are dropping because the area is under tension. The plates are spreading apart, and so the Jordan flows in such a structure that's bounded by faults on both sides. So it's really a dramatic geologic landscape. And so that, so this whole area that's below sea level, and then right next to it is some, there's a big, what would it be in feet, probably 4,000 or 5,000 foot elevation change. Not huge, but, from below sea level to significantly above sea level, which is where, say, Jerusalem is, the highlands of Judea, the hill country of Judea, as we translate it in the gospel. So there's that big, so that low-lying desert, it's in the rain shadow of these hills, so the air from the Mediterranean can't make it that far. So it's really a dramatic landscape with a lot of change. And Dr. Isbouts, alluded to this, that there are these big changes in different landscapes. Galilee, and then the great valley between Galilee and Judea, so to speak, southern Israel. And then there's, southern Israel looks like that. It has these highlands. It's got a fertile area near the coast. And then it has this desert near the Dead Sea and extending, well south into what's called the Negev, which is very, very dry indeed. And that, then that extends down toward the Sinai, and then you're into Egypt. So that's by itself and that's a dynamic environment.
What do you see as some interconnection between that environment, especially its geology, and meanings that can be drawn spiritually or philosophically from the Bible and its stories?
Well, it's definitely a place where the sort of dramatic things that we occasionally see happen in the Old Testament are likely to happen. I mean, it's a place where, during the ice ages, there were massive floods. I mean, and we had that sort of thing in North America as well. There, even in Indiana. So at one time, Lake Erie was so large that it extended all the way to Fort Wayne, Indiana. If those of you who are familiar with the geography of northern Indiana and Ohio or Southwest Michigan, so it's Lake Erie was much, much bigger, and there's kind of a ridge there at Fort Wayne, and so the water broke through this ridge and created a flood. So there was massive flooding there. There was massive flooding in the Kankakee, which is northwest Indiana. So there was another place where there was sort of a barrier that had been bulldozed into place by the glaciers, and then as they receded, it held water until the water broke through and created a fairly catastrophic flood. Same thing has happened out in Washington State. There's what they call the channeled scablands out there, and then this huge basin in the Holy Land likewise has had a history of catastrophic flooding. Could that be related to the story that we know as Noah's flood? I suppose that's conceivable. I've heard that connection, mentioned as a potential, but that's really all I could tell you at my own, level of knowledge about that. But it's, again, it's a place where dramatic things can happen. Another potential connection that I've heard in the past, actually, there's a book called another National Geographic book. Actually, I guess we're doing a lot of product placement for National Geographic this month, but. They put out some good books. There's a book from the 80s, so they're probably not actively printing it anymore, but it's an excellent book called Exploring Our Living Planet, which is where I learned most of what I knew about plate tectonics as a teenager. And it's a great book. It's a fantastic book. It has a history of, how the ideas of plate tectonics came to be in the post-war era. And then, and then it takes you on a tour of the world into all these different tectonic environments, including the Holy Land. And so it talks about some of these issues. It talks about, the plagues in Exodus. Some of the plagues in Exodus could have been due to volcanic fallout. There's even been, so people have speculated that there was a giant eruption in the Aegean, in the Eastern Mediterranean. Maybe it's actually the island of Santorini specifically, might have been at the right time to be associated with all those really dramatic geologic events that seem to be alluded to in the book of Exodus. So in particular, a certain kind of ashfall could make the river look red, the Nile River look red, where it turns into blood. And then the potential for either a tsunami, starting in the Mediterranean, I guess, potentially crossing into the Red Sea, or an earthquake in the Red Sea. Of course, the Red Sea itself is susceptible to earthquakes. So the parting of the Red Sea, that itself could be that could have been a story that has a geologic basis that, would be fitting in a tectonically active environment like that. That could have been the mechanism by which that happened. I mean, of course, the book of Exodus does actually specifically mention a wind associated with it. That goes beyond my ability to speculate about, but yeah, the idea that some of that could happen, and then there, it's a frequent enough thing. I'm told, actually this book that I just mentioned, I believe, is where I heard it. So this, the Jordan River flows in this basin that's defined by faulting. Actually, the Mississippi River flows into a basin that's, was defined by the continent of North America. Sometimes continents will start to split apart and then not sort of follow through. So the Mississippi River actually flows in a rift where a continent started to sort of come unsowed, and then didn't follow through, probably during the time when Pangea was breaking up. So North America started to rip there, and that area subsided and got low. And now, of course, it's that rift basin is very full of sediment. Likewise, the Jordan River is flowing in this basin, in this deep graben with faults on either side where it's dropping down into the earth, basically. And so that's a great environment for, first of all, there are earthquakes because there are faults. And in fact, there was a magnitude 6-ish earthquake in Jericho back in the 1920s. That's, the last, really severe earthquake in that area. And so, well, Jericho will come up in a second, but so in the book of Joshua, so Moses has just died. The book of Deuteronomy, Moses is giving the children of Israel their farewell address. They're across the Jordan River in what's now Jordan. That part of what's now Jordan was the land that was inhabited by the Moabites, if memory serves. So Moses is up on this mountain. He gets to look at the Holy Land, but God was so demanding at that point, right? Moses makes one little mistake at some point. He's like, I don't know if God is really going to work another miracle for these ungrateful, jackwagons. And apparently that's enough to mean that he's not going to get to see the Holy Land. He's not going to get to step into the Holy Land himself. He's going to get to see it, but he won't step into it. So he has to hand over command to Joshua. So at the beginning of the book of Joshua, well, we got to cross the river. And so, of course, God shuts the river down for them. I mean, that's easy, right? The Red Sea, and it probably wasn't the whole Red Sea. It was probably just, one of the narrow arms at the north end of the Red Sea that was, presumably what the Israelites crossed. But the Jordan gets dammed by landslides from earthquakes sometimes. That's a known thing, and potentially when the prophet Elijah and Elisha are crossing the Jordan at some point, potentially that's describing a similar situation where there's an earthquake, there's steep slopes, there's a landslide. Landslides can block rivers until the river sort of roars, cuts through it and then rushes back into place. Again, dynamic environment where dramatic stuff happens. Likewise, not too long after that in the book of Joshua, so now we're taking over the Holy Land. And so one of the first places they encountered was the city of Jericho, which is a very ancient city, multiple generations of walls built around it. And so with the story that the book of Joshua tells is that the Israelites circled these, really, apparently very serious fortifications and blew their trumpets and the walls fell down. Another thing that might happen during an earthquake, an unusually large earthquake. An unusually large, well-timed earthquake could actually explain a number of these things. So whether it was, one series of earthquakes and, there may be a couple of large aftershocks, or maybe it all happened at once. Then, that same earthquake that dammed up the, or aftershocks are a thing. There's no need to insist one or the other. And the foreshock, the main shock could have weakened the walls, and the aftershock could have finished knocking them over. That's the thing. Of course, the sacred writer is not, doesn't exactly have, a modern military chronology of, and at 08:30 hours we did this. We're not, we don't have quite that level of detail. So, but yeah, there's so many things that. The thing I think to avoid, probably a good place to wrap up for this week, the thing I think we really ought to avoid that, the late second millennium sort of fell into the habit of doing is assuming that the Bible is just made up crap, because ancient people just aren't trustworthy. They were dumb, they were untrustworthy, and they just made up crap. And I think that's something that Dr. Isbout's, work kind of tells against. And it's just a bad idea to carry around with you in general. This idea that we're superior to the ancients and we know what's actually going on. And those old, stupid, superstitious, homophobic, fill in however many blanks you need to fill in, racist, etc. They can't be trusted. There's no wisdom to be gained from anything earlier than, I don't know, what would you have to place it at, 2010 or something, when people started, supporting gay marriage in droves, whatever, your goalposts, your trailing 10-year goalposts, that there weren't any people worth listening to prior to 10 years in the past or something like that, which was certainly the case in the 1960s, right? That pattern was already set. So, jeez.
Never trust anybody over 30. It was
That's right.
In the 60s.
Right. Well, all those people are way over 30 at this point, and therefore they can't be trusted. So... But yeah.
Oh, amen. Yes. Well, I like the idea that science, you're using science to explain it without challenging the religious beliefs and the religious understandings, and in fact, you're heightening the religious interpretation and deepening the religious interpretation by explaining in scientific terms some of the things that have puzzled people or caused people to dismiss the Bible. That's a perfect combination of science and religion.
Yeah, I mean, and you can let the science challenge the religion if and when that becomes necessary, but recognizing that that's very often not the case. In many cases, it's just a question of actually looking at it long enough to see where the possible concord could be, rather than just sort of dismissing it, based on what I personally carry in my head and what I personally think is plausible.
Yeah. Well, I salute you. I think it's a great grounds for projects and research and just avocational fun coming forth in your geological knowledge.
It's one of those things where it's like, I think this book would be great. I'm not really the person to contribute, a lot of the direct subject matter to it. Maybe I could just encourage other people to do so. But yeah, or maybe the book is out there and I just need to go find it and read it.
That's right. A lot of times it's just bringing people together.
Yeah, I mean, so much in human endeavor happens that way. So yeah. All right. Well, it's good to talk to you, Bill.
Yeah, likewise.
We'll come back. We're not even sure what we'll talk about next time, but we're working on it, and we look forward to it.
Yes.
We'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of That's So Second Millennium. TSSM's audio producer is Morgan Burkhardt. Our theme music, Igneous Grok, was composed and performed by Vin Marquardt. For my co-host Bill Schmidt, I'm Paul Giesting. Until next time.